It is a house built to last forever, and yet it came perilously close to becoming an anachronism, a monument too heavy for its own century to carry. On a misted slope of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Biltmore still stands with unsettling confidence, 250 rooms carved into limestone, more than 175,000 square feet of corridors, libraries, staircases, and silence. Once surrounded by over 100,000 acres of engineered wilderness, it was conceived not as a retreat, but as a statement, an American answer to Europe's ancestral power. And for a moment in history, it worked. Presidents arrived. Diplomats lingered. An entire social order rehearsed its permanence inside these walls. But permanence, it turned out, was an illusion carefully financed. The estate was completed in 1895 after 6 years of construction and the labor of thousands. Its cost, $5 million at the time, was less a budget than a declaration of immunity from consequence. Inside, tapestries older than the United States absorbed candlelight. Outside, forests were replanted tree by tree to resemble a vanished old-world pastoral. Everything here was designed to slow time, to refuse decay, to make ambition look like heritage. And yet, within a single generation, the arithmetic of power began to fail. The household shrank. The guests stopped coming. Taxes rose. Fortunes thinned. There were moments, quite bureaucratic moments, when Biltmore was discussed not as a legacy, but as a liability. When its future depended less on reverence than on spreadsheets. When demolition was never proposed aloud, but survival was no longer assumed. What saves a palace when belief in its purpose collapses? To answer that, we must move backward, before the stone, before the forests, before the name Biltmore itself, to a young man shaped by inheritance and absence, and to a single, fateful decision, not to build a home, but to anchor a dynasty in a land that had never asked for one. Before Biltmore was imagined, before limestone was quarried and forests were replanted to resemble an older continent, this land knew a different rhythm, older, harsher, and indifferent to grandeur. Western North Carolina in the mid-19th century was not a destination. It was a passageway, a refuge, a scar. The Blue Ridge Mountains folded into one another like a barricade against the modern world, their valleys shaped by subsistence farming, seasonal isolation, and a memory of removal that still lingered unspoken. Only decades earlier, the Cherokee had been forced from these hills along routes that would later be renamed and romanticized. What remained was not wilderness, but a worked, wounded landscape, a cleared, exhausted, and quietly waiting. After the Civil War, the region entered a long, ambiguous pause. The Confederacy was gone, but the promised future never quite arrived. Railroads crept in slowly, carving steel lines through granite and timber, not to bring prosperity to the mountains, but to extract what could still be taken from them. Logging camps stripped entire slopes bare. Rivers ran brown. Small towns appeared and vanished with the timber market. The mountains endured, but the people learned to expect abandonment. Asheville, then a modest settlement, began to change almost by accident. Its elevation made it a curiosity for doctors who believed cool air could slow disease. Its remoteness appealed to industrialists looking to disappear for a season without fully surrendering comfort. By the 1880s, hotels rose along the ridgelines, promising health, quiet, and escape. The southern Appalachians were being rebranded, not as a homeland, but as a restorative landscape for outsiders with money and time. It was into this unstable transition that northern capital arrived, bringing with it a new kind of ambition. Not the ambition to settle. Not the ambition to integrate. But the ambition to remake. Large tracts of land were suddenly for sale, cheaply, their previous owners unable to compete with industrial-scale extraction or modern taxation. Thousands of acres could be acquired with signatures rather than bloodlines. In Europe, estates were inherited. Here, they could be assembled, purchased, engineered into something that looked ancient, even if it was not. This distinction mattered, because what was forming in these mountains was not merely a private refuge, but a prototype, the American estate. A concept still untested, still insecure. The United States had wealth, but it lacked the visual language of permanence. There were no medieval castles, no ancestral halls worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. For those who possessed unprecedented fortunes, the question was no longer how to earn money, but how to make it mean something beyond a single lifetime. And so attention turned south and inward, toward land that was empty enough to be reshaped and distant enough to feel sovereign. By the late 1880s, rumors circulated in Asheville of a buyer unlike the rest. Someone acquiring land not by the acre, but by the horizon. Farms, forests, ridges, stitched together into a single, silent domain. Local papers speculated. Surveyors appeared. Boundaries shifted. Roads were rerouted. What was happening did not yet have a name, but it had momentum. This was not development. It was preparation. The scale alone was disorienting. Tens of thousands of acres consolidated under one vision. Timberlands purchased not for immediate profit, but held. Fields left fallow. Hillsides observed rather than cleared. It was as if someone were waiting for an idea large enough to justify the accumulation. At the center of this gathering force was a fortune that did not originate here and never needed to. The money came from iron rails and shipping lanes, from cities where speed mattered more than scenery. It came from a family whose name had become synonymous with American acceleration, whose wealth had been built by compressing distance, not inhabiting it. And yet, the man who would claim these mountains was not drawn to motion. He was drawn to silence. While others in his lineage expanded outward, buying, consolidating, conquering markets, he turned inward, toward books, landscapes, and the architecture of retreat. He did not need to prove success. That had been done for him. What he faced instead was a quieter, more corrosive problem: how to live inside a fortune so large it erased necessity. The mountains offered an answer, or at least the illusion of one. Here was space vast enough to absorb wealth without reflecting it too sharply. Here was terrain that suggested continuity with older worlds, feudal, agrarian, slow, without requiring their history. Here, one could build not a house, but a context. A place where money might be disguised as stewardship and power softened into taste. But even before the first stone was laid, the contradictions were already present. The land had been bought because it was cheap, because it was wounded, because its previous custodians had been displaced by forces larger than themselves. The estate that would rise here would depend on invisibility, of labor, of loss, of prior claims. Its beauty would be curated. Its forests replanted. Its past selectively remembered. Ambition, in this sense, did not announce itself with noise. It moved quietly, under the banner of improvement. And somewhere between Asheville's muddy streets and the crest of the Blue Ridge, a decision was forming that would bind one man's inner life to an entire landscape. A decision not to join society, but to host it. Not to inherit a castle, but to manufacture one. Not to escape time, but to slow it enough to believe he had. In the next chapter, we meet that man, not at the height of his power, but at the moment when inheritance becomes burden, and ambition disguises itself as vision. George Washington Vanderbilt too did not arrive in the mountains seeking dominion. He arrived carrying something quieter and heavier, an inheritance so complete it left no clear role to perform. He was born into the most accelerated fortune of 19th century America, a dynasty assembled not by centuries of feudal consolidation, but by compression, railroads binding continents, steamships shrinking oceans, capital moving faster than custom could absorb. By the time George Vanderbilt came of age, the family name no longer signified effort. It signified inevitability. Wealth flowed to him not as reward, but as condition. Unlike his older relatives, he showed little interest in expanding the machinery that had produced it. He did not command rail lines. He did not dominate boardrooms. Instead, he retreated into books, languages, travel. He read voraciously, collected first editions, spoke multiple European tongues with ease. In a family defined by motion and conquest, George Vanderbilt cultivated stillness. But stillness, when financed at scale, becomes something else. By his 30s, he had seen Europe not as a tourist, but as a student of permanence. He moved through French chateaux and English country houses with the eye of someone studying not beauty, but endurance. These estates were not impressive merely because they were large. They were convincing because they appeared inevitable, rooted in land, in lineage, in a rhythm that made wealth feel earned by time rather than seized by speed. America had no such language. Its fortunes were too young, too abrupt. Its great houses, when they existed, felt theatrical, ornaments rather than anchors. For men like Vanderbilt, the problem was not money, but legitimacy. How to make a life inside wealth that had arrived too quickly to carry memory. Biltmore would be his answer. Not a residence in the conventional sense, but a constructed lineage. A place where books, art, and landscape could stand in for ancestors. Where permanence could be rehearsed, if not inherited. The choice of North Carolina was not accidental. Its mountains suggested age. Its distance offered control. Its relative isolation allowed fantasy to take root without constant interruption from the modern world that had produced his fortune. Yet even this retreat required an army. To give form to his vision, Vanderbilt turned to Richard Morris Hunt, the most European of American architects, a man fluent in the visual grammar of aristocracy. Hunt did not merely design buildings, he translated social aspiration into stone. Together, they imagined an estate that would not imitate a single chateau, but absorb many, French Renaissance massing, medieval silhouettes, a vocabulary designed to feel both ancient and inevitable. Every decision pointed inward. The library would dominate. Not as decoration, but as confession. Over 10,000 volumes, many rare, arranged not for display but for use. Knowledge, not lineage, would be the center of gravity. The house would host guests, but never too many. Grandeur would exist, but disciplined, measured in proportion rather than ostentation. Still, contradictions deepened. To build an illusion of permanence, Vanderbilt would need impermanence, thousands of laborers whose names would never be recorded. To simulate ancient stewardship, he would acquire land at a scale that erased prior lives. To escape modernity, he would rely on its most advanced technologies, electric lighting, central heating, elevators, refrigeration. Biltmore would be both a refuge from the age and its most elaborate product. And beneath it all, there was urgency. Construction began not because the idea was complete, but because time felt unstable. The Gilded Age was already tightening, its excesses attracting scrutiny, its fortunes vulnerable to public resentment and political recalibration. Vanderbilt sensed, perhaps instinctively, that this window, where wealth could still translate into private kingdoms, would not remain open forever. So he committed fully. He did not build slowly. He built decisively. He assembled land faster than memory could catch up. He ordered stone by the trainload. He shaped forests not as ecosystems, but as compositions. What he was creating was not simply an estate, but a buffer against historical judgment, a place that might outlast criticism by becoming too embedded in the landscape to remove. But even as plans solidified and crews mobilized, the central paradox remained unresolved. This house was meant to anchor a life, yet its owner had not decided how to live in it. It was designed to host society, yet he distrusted its rituals. It promised continuity, yet he had no heir. Biltmore was becoming vast before it became inhabited. In the next chapter, stone will rise, corridors will lengthen, and the silence that Vanderbilt sought will be constructed, room by room, by hands that would never be invited to linger inside it. Construction at Biltmore did not begin with ceremony. It began with noise, metal striking stone, timber cracking under weight, voices carrying across valleys that had rarely heard commands shouted in unison. More than 1,000 workers moved through the site at its peak, many drawn from nearby towns, others arriving with the rail lines that now cut into the mountains. Stonemasons from Europe worked alongside local laborers whose familiarity with the land did not translate into authorship of what would replace it. Their names dissolved into payroll ledgers, their presence absorbed into the scale of the undertaking. What endured was the stone. Indiana limestone was quarried and shipped hundreds of miles south. Steel beams followed. Oak paneling, marble fireplaces, carved ceilings, materials chosen not for regional continuity, but for symbolic weight. This was not Appalachian architecture. It was imported authority, assembled with industrial efficiency to resemble pre-industrial permanence. The house grew outward and upward at once. Walls thickened. Towers asserted themselves against the ridgeline. Windows multiplied, not to invite the outside in, but to survey it. From above, Biltmore began to read not as a dwelling, but as a citadel softened by ornament. Every angle suggested command. Every corridor, control. And yet, inside the chaos of construction, there were moments of fragility. Accidents were inevitable. Scaffolding failed. Stone slipped. Men were injured, sometimes killed, though records softened the language. These were not tragedies in the public sense. They were accepted costs, absorbed into the project's momentum. The estate demanded progress, and progress rarely paused to count what it consumed. Vanderbilt visited the site frequently, but never theatrically. He walked among the foundations with measured attention, speaking more to Hunt than to the men working below. His involvement was meticulous, even obsessive. He revised plans midstream, expanded rooms already framed, added complexity where simplicity might have sufficed. Silence, he discovered, required architecture to enforce it. The most ambitious element was not the house, but the land. Under the guidance of Frederick Law Olmsted, the architect of Central Park, Biltmore's grounds were transformed into a controlled experiment in American stewardship. Forests were replanted according to scientific principles. Views were engineered. Roads curved deliberately to obscure scale, revealing the house only after long, winding approaches. Nature, here, was not wild. It was instructed. This, too, carried its own quiet violence. Entire hillsides were stripped and replanted. Native rhythms were interrupted to create pastoral illusions modeled on English estates that had evolved over centuries, not years. What appeared timeless was, in truth, hurried. A landscape forced to age prematurely. Inside, the house sealed itself off from the world with deliberate efficiency. Central heating coursed through hidden passages. Electric lights erased darkness on command. Servant corridors threaded invisibly through the structure, allowing labor to circulate without presence. The design perfected a social separation that made comfort possible without contact. The result was control without confrontation. By 1895, Biltmore stood complete, or close enough to declare itself finished. 250 rooms, a library stretching across 3 floors, a banquet hall rising 7 stories, bedrooms enough to host a court. And yet, the dominant sensation was not excess, but distance. The scale insulated as much as it impressed. When Vanderbilt finally moved in, the silence he had sought was there. But it was not empty. It echoed. Sound traveled strangely through the halls, softening voices, elongating footsteps. A single person could walk for minutes without encountering another. The house functioned as intended, absorbing presence, diluting intimacy. Guests would later describe it as magnificent, but disorienting. A place that dwarfed its inhabitants, reminding them constantly of their relative smallness. For Vanderbilt, this was both comfort and confinement. He had built a sanctuary from the noise of his era, but he had also constructed a structure that mirrored his own inward retreat. The house did not demand participation. It permitted withdrawal. And in doing so, it began to shape the life that would unfold within it. In the next chapter, Biltmore will open its doors, not to family, but to society. To ritualized hospitality, formal dinners, and the performance of belonging that Vanderbilt both required and resisted. The halls are ready. The echoes are waiting. When Biltmore entered its social life, it did so cautiously, almost reluctantly. The house was finished, but it was not yet inhabited in the emotional sense. Its rooms waited to be instructed on how to behave. The first gatherings were formal by necessity rather than desire. Invitations extended not from warmth, but from obligation. In the winter season, carriages wound their way up the long approach, arriving at a house whose scale announced authority long before a word was spoken. Guests were received beneath vaulted ceilings, their coats taken by servants who seemed to vanish as soon as their task was complete. Conversation softened instinctively. Biltmore demanded a lower register. Dinners unfolded with precision. Silver reflected candlelight. Music carried upward into spaces too large to hold it fully. The choreography was flawless, but the atmosphere was curiously restrained. Unlike older aristocratic homes, Biltmore had no inherited informality, no accumulated rituals softened by repetition across generations. Every gesture here was new, rehearsed, slightly self-conscious. George Vanderbilt moved through these evenings with courteous distance. He was attentive, articulate, and visibly learned, yet never expansive. He listened more than he spoke. He observed. The house allowed this. Its vastness absorbed silence without embarrassment. One could withdraw into a library alcove or a gallery corridor and disappear without explanation. But the cost of such discretion was isolation. The estate was designed to host dozens, yet it discouraged intimacy. Bedrooms were separated by wings. Corridors stretched long enough to erase the sense of proximity. Even shared spaces emphasized spectacle over connection. Guests admired the tapestries, the views, the books, but rarely each other. They were united by awe, not closeness. For Vanderbilt, this dynamic mirrored his inner life. He had inherited society's highest expectations without its hunger. He did not seek power over people, he sought protection from their demands. Biltmore offered that protection, but it also reinforced the very distance it was meant to soothe. Marriage came late. In 1898, Vanderbilt married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, herself connected to old New York lineage. The union was appropriate, affectionate, and hopeful, but it arrived after the house had already defined the terms of life within it. Edith brought warmth, social intuition, and an understanding of domestic rhythm that Biltmore lacked. She softened the estate, encouraged gatherings that felt less ceremonial, introduced a gentler pulse to daily life. Yet even this adjustment struggled against scale. The house was not built for a young family. It was built for endurance. For legacy imagined in advance. When their daughter, Cornelia, was born in 1900, her presence filled only a fraction of the space available. Nurseries echoed. Gardens dwarfed childhood. What should have felt expansive instead emphasized how much of the house remained untouched. Still, there were moments of genuine life. Music recitals in the salon. Long afternoons in the library. Walks through the engineered forests that had begun, at last, to resemble maturity. The estate breathed cautiously. It performed its role as a center of cultured existence. And for a time, it seemed possible that Biltmore might become what Vanderbilt had intended, a place where wealth could be lived with, rather than merely housed. But history was moving faster than architecture. The turn of the century brought new pressures, economic, political, cultural. The age that had permitted such private kingdoms was narrowing. Public attitudes toward concentrated wealth hardened. Taxation increased. Industrial fortunes were scrutinized. What had once been admired as ambition now attracted suspicion. Vanderbilt felt this shift acutely. His absences grew longer. Travel took him away from the mountains, across oceans, into diplomatic circles and intellectual retreats. When he returned, the house felt different, not altered in form, but heavier in implication. It no longer symbolized possibility. It symbolized responsibility. And responsibility, unlike ambition, does not inspire. In the next chapter, we follow Vanderbilt beyond Biltmore's gates, into a wider world that would test his detachment, deepen his introspection, and quietly begin the process by which the estate would come to represent not refuge, but weight. Beyond Biltmore's gates, the world refused the stillness George Vanderbilt had tried to preserve. The early 20th century unfolded with a restlessness that architecture could not contain. Empires tightened and trembled. Markets lurched. Political power shifted away from private hands and toward institutions that spoke the language of reform. The very forces that had enabled Vanderbilt's fortune now questioned its legitimacy. Vanderbilt traveled often during these years, not in search of conquest, but of perspective. Europe remained a point of reference, its salons quieter, its hierarchies more practiced in the art of decline. He observed aging aristocracies with scholarly detachment, noting how even ancient houses were being opened, subdivided, or surrendered to the public. Permanence, he learned, was not guaranteed by age alone. When he returned to Biltmore, the contrast was stark. The estate remained visually intact, but socially hollowed. Large rooms waited unused. Staff numbers fluctuated. Entire wings fell silent for weeks at a time. The house functioned, but it no longer performed. It had become a vessel for absence, a monument to a way of life that had already begun to recede. Edith Vanderbilt shouldered more of the estate's daily gravity. She managed schedules, entertained when necessary, and sought to anchor family life in a structure that resisted domesticity. Her efforts were earnest, but constrained. Biltmore was too large to be warmed by intention alone. George, increasingly reserved, turned inward again. His health began to falter. Travel fatigued him. The intellectual refuge he once found in books narrowed into something more brittle, a retreat not from society, but from uncertainty. He had built a world to escape time, and now time was pressing in from all sides. Then, in 1914, the illusion of insulation collapsed. The outbreak of World War I reordered priorities overnight. Wealth lost its neutrality. Estates across Europe were requisitioned, damaged, or emptied. The idea of private grandeur began to feel morally untenable. Even from the mountains of North Carolina, the shockwaves were unmistakable. Vanderbilt responded not with spectacle, but with restraint. He offered Biltmore as a place of service rather than display, opening portions of the estate for agricultural production, supporting relief efforts, aligning the property with contribution rather than withdrawal. It was a quiet pivot, but a meaningful one. The estate's purpose shifted, subtly, from assertion to justification. Yet the internal cost was severe. In 1914, at just 51 years old, George Vanderbilt died suddenly after complications from surgery. The house outlived him by decades, but his presence evaporated almost instantly. The silence he had curated deepened, now stripped of its author. Edith, still young, inherited not only the estate but its contradictions. Biltmore passed to her and to Cornelia as legacy and liability entwined. The scale that had once promised continuity now threatened collapse. Taxes mounted. Maintenance drained resources. The social world that had validated such estates was gone. The house remained, but belief in it wavered. For the first time, Biltmore's future was openly uncertain. Not in dramatic gestures, but in calculations: what could be kept, what might be sold, what could no longer be justified. Grandeur, once a shield, had become exposure. In the next chapter, inheritance will reveal its true weight. The estate will no longer belong to a vision, but to a family struggling to decide whether that vision can survive its creator. Inheritance rarely arrives as ceremony. At Biltmore, it arrived as accounting. After George Vanderbilt's death, the estate did not pause to mourn. It demanded decisions. Roofs needed repair. Staff required wages. Acres required management. Taxes, once an abstraction softened by surplus, became relentless, recurring reminders that grandeur had ongoing costs, even in silence. Edith Vanderbilt stepped into a role she had never sought: steward of the largest private home in America, and guardian of a vision whose author was gone. She was capable, pragmatic, and keenly aware of how quickly admiration could turn into resentment in a changing nation. The Gilded Age had ended without ceremony. What replaced it was scrutiny. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Biltmore's upkeep consumed enormous sums each year. Heating alone demanded planning at industrial scale. Staff numbers, once a given, were reduced. Entire sections of the house were closed off, their doors locked not for secrecy, but for survival. Grandeur was rationed room by room. For Cornelia Vanderbilt, still young, the estate loomed less as inheritance than as inevitability. It shaped her childhood without asking consent, its corridors too long, its routines too formal, its expectations implicit but heavy. She was born into a house already past its moment, asked to embody continuity in an era that no longer valued it. By the early 1920s, Edith made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. She sold large portions of the estate's land. Not impulsively, but strategically. Tens of thousands of acres were released, some to private buyers, others to the state. What remained would later form the nucleus of Pisgah National Forest, a transformation that quietly inverted the estate's original premise. Land once gathered to assert private control was now surrendered to public stewardship. It was a retreat framed as contribution. The sale stabilized finances, but it fractured the illusion of a self-contained world. Biltmore was no longer sovereign. It was porous, its borders redrawn by necessity rather than ambition. What remained, the house, the core grounds, felt suddenly exposed. Cornelia came of age within this recalibration. Educated, intelligent, and aware of the contradictions surrounding her, she inherited not power, but scrutiny. When she married John Francis Amherst Cecil, an English aristocrat, the union was read by some as a restoration of legitimacy, old world title meeting new world money. In truth, it was another attempt to reconcile incompatible systems. The couple did not live permanently at Biltmore. They could not. The estate resisted ordinary family life. Its scale required staff rather than intimacy. Its expectations discouraged informality. What had once been envisioned as a dynastic seat proved ill-suited to actual succession. The house did not adapt to its heirs, it waited for them to adapt to it. And they did not. By the 1930s, the Great Depression delivered the final reckoning. Wealth across America contracted sharply. Public sentiment hardened further against conspicuous excess. Estates fell. Mansions were demolished, abandoned, or stripped for parts. Biltmore survived, but barely. Its survival owed less to reverence than to reluctant innovation. Edith faced a choice that would redefine the estate's meaning. In 1930, Biltmore opened to the public. It was not framed as surrender, but as invitation. Visitors paid to walk the halls, to glimpse tapestries and libraries that had once signaled private authority. What had been built to exclude now required visibility. The house, once a refuge from modernity, entered the marketplace of experience. This was not restoration. It was conversion. Rooms were curated. Narratives were adjusted. The story of Biltmore shifted from personal ambition to cultural artifact. The Vanderbilt name remained, but its role changed, from owner to symbol, from authority to attraction. The psychological cost was profound. A home that becomes a destination ceases to belong to anyone in full. Privacy dissolves. Memory is edited. Silence is interrupted by footsteps not invited, but tolerated. Biltmore survived by relinquishing the very isolation it had been designed to guarantee. Yet survival altered perception. The house no longer stood as proof of invincibility. It stood as evidence of adaptation, of compromise, of a family choosing endurance over purity of vision. The estate's meaning became layered, simultaneously triumphant and diminished. By mid-century, Biltmore had stabilized financially, but its identity was permanently transformed. It was no longer a private assertion of permanence. It was a public negotiation with history. Inheritance, in the end, did not preserve Vanderbilt ambition. It revised it. In the next chapter, we will follow the reluctant revival that followed, how new custodians navigated the ghosts of grandeur, and how Biltmore learned to perform continuity in a world that no longer believed in it instinctively. Revival at Biltmore did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as necessity, measured and unsentimental. By the time new custodians assumed daily responsibility for the estate, the question was no longer whether Biltmore was magnificent. That had been settled long ago. The question was whether magnificence could justify itself in a century that valued access over awe, utility over inheritance. The answer, if there was one, would have to be negotiated carefully, room by room, season by season. The Cecils approached the task without romance. They understood what sentimentality could not fix. Biltmore's survival would depend on transforming reverence into revenue, history into experience, without allowing the house to collapse into spectacle. It was a narrow path, bordered on one side by insolvency, on the other by erasure of meaning. Opening the estate to the public had been an act of surrender, but managing it required discipline. Visitors arrived not as guests, but as witnesses. They moved in controlled flows, guided by narratives that emphasized craftsmanship, culture, and continuity rather than conquest. The house learned to speak in a new register. Where once it had asserted authority through scale and silence, it now relied on explanation. Labels appeared. Pathways were formalized. Rooms were frozen into representative moments, their messiness edited away. What emerged was not a living house, but a curated one. This curation was itself a kind of power. Decisions about what to show and what to close, which stories to foreground and which to soften, shaped public memory as effectively as stone once shaped landscape. The Vanderbilt ambition did not vanish, it mutated, exercised now through narrative control rather than exclusion. Still, the past resisted containment. Staff spoke quietly of rooms that felt heavier than others. Of corridors that carried a different temperature. These were not ghost stories in the theatrical sense, but accumulations of presence, architectural memories that could not be smoothed by interpretation panels. Biltmore retained an emotional gravity that visitors sensed even if they could not name it. Maintenance remained relentless. Every winter tested the structure. Every summer strained logistics. Restoration projects never ended, they merely rotated. Roofs, tapestries, stonework, each required specialized care. The estate's survival depended on an invisible workforce whose labor echoed that of the original builders, still essential, still largely unrecognized. Outside the house, the land continued its quiet transformation. What had once been private dominion evolved into shared resource. Forests matured under scientific management. Agricultural programs adapted to modern markets. The estate's relationship to its surroundings softened, becoming less extractive, more reciprocal. In an unintended reversal, Biltmore began to approximate the stewardship it had once only symbolized. Yet this adaptation came with loss. As the house stabilized, it also thinned. Certain rooms were never reopened. Entire stories faded from public telling, not erased, but deprioritized. The estate learned which memories attracted visitors and which unsettled them. Grandeur was safe. Ambivalence was not. This selective memory created tension within the family. To live alongside a house that no longer fully belonged to them required restraint. Private quarters were carved out discreetly. Personal routines adjusted to public schedules. The line between home and institution blurred until it was no longer clear which role dominated. The Cecils became caretakers of an idea larger than themselves, inheritors of responsibility rather than privilege. And yet, the revival worked. Biltmore did not become obsolete. It adapted just enough to endure. It weathered economic shifts, cultural skepticism, even war, by repositioning itself as heritage rather than hierarchy. In doing so, it escaped the fate of many contemporaries: demolition, abandonment, irrelevance. But endurance came at a psychological cost. The house was no longer allowed to be quiet on its own terms. Silence was scheduled. Stillness became part of programming. What had once been organic withdrawal turned into curated atmosphere. The estate survived, but it did so by performing itself continuously. This performance masked a deeper unease. Because beneath the restored ceilings and replanted vistas lingered the unresolved question: what, exactly, had been saved? The physical structure, certainly. The aesthetic ambition, largely. But the original purpose, the attempt to construct permanence out of wealth alone, had quietly failed. Biltmore endured not as proof of that ambition's success, but as evidence of its limits. In the next chapter, we will trace how these transformations deepened as the 20th century advanced, how restoration and modernization intertwined, and how each effort to preserve the estate also risked smoothing away the very tensions that made it meaningful. As the century advanced, Biltmore entered a long twilight of reinvention, not dramatic enough to be called rebirth, not passive enough to be called decline. Modernization arrived in increments. Electrical systems were updated. Climate control was refined to protect aging tapestries and paper. Accessibility was discreetly introduced, threaded through a structure never designed to welcome bodies en masse. Each intervention was framed as preservation, yet each altered the original equilibrium. The house was no longer resisting time. It was negotiating with it. Public expectations shifted as well. Visitors no longer came merely to be impressed. They came seeking meaning, context, critique, reassurance that grandeur could coexist with responsibility. Biltmore responded by expanding its narrative outward. Exhibitions addressed forestry, conservation, agriculture. The estate was presented not as a frozen artifact of privilege, but as a living system adapting to contemporary values. This reframing was deliberate. By emphasizing stewardship over spectacle, Biltmore aligned itself with a language the modern world could accept. The forests, once symbols of control, became proof of foresight. The sale of land to create national forest lands was reinterpreted as legacy rather than retreat. What had been born of necessity was recast as vision. Yet transformation rarely occurs without friction. Local communities watched the estate's evolution with mixed sentiment. Tourism brought revenue, but also traffic, seasonal labor, and a sense that history was being packaged for consumption. Biltmore's presence remained dominant, an economic anchor and an emotional outlier. It was both employer and reminder, opportunity and imbalance. Within the house, authenticity became increasingly difficult to define. Restoration teams faced choices that were never neutral. Should a room be returned to a single year, or allowed to show accumulation? Should wear be repaired or honored? Should the estate speak with the voice of its founder, or with the perspective of those who sustained it afterward? Each answer privileged one version of truth over another. The result was coherence, but not innocence. By mid-century, Biltmore had achieved stability through narrative mastery. It presented itself as continuity, unchanged in spirit, carefully evolving in form. But beneath that surface lay a quieter erosion. The rawness of its origin story, the audacity, the imbalance, the unresolved ambition, was increasingly difficult to access. Grandeur had been refined into comfort. The house still dwarfed its visitors, but it no longer unsettled them. Its corridors guided rather than disoriented. Its silence felt curated, not absolute. What once challenged belief now reassured it. Biltmore had become safe. And safety, for a structure born of excess, carried its own loss. Because in smoothing its edges, the estate risked losing the tension that made it matter. The psychological drama of a man attempting to anchor himself through architecture, the ethical ambiguity of land consolidation, the fragility masked by scale, all of it softened beneath layers of explanation and upkeep. The twilight transformation preserved the body of Biltmore while thinning its shadow. Yet shadows do not vanish entirely. They linger in the spaces left unvisited, the stories untold, the rooms that remain closed not for preservation, but because their meaning resists display. They surface in the quiet recognition that the estate survives by being useful, not by being believed in. In the next chapter, we turn to restoration itself, not as salvation, but as compromise. To the ongoing effort to arrest decay while accepting that something essential may already be receding. Shall we continue to chapter 9? Restoration at Biltmore has never been a single act. It is a condition, perpetual, unfinished, quietly anxious. By the late 20th century, preservation had become both mission and burden. Every repaired stone, every stabilized beam, every conserved tapestry was a victory measured against inevitability. The house did not age gracefully on its own. It required intervention, expertise, and constant vigilance. Time was no longer an adversary to be resisted with grandeur, but a force to be managed with spreadsheets and schedules. Restoration promised fidelity to the past, yet fidelity proved elusive. Materials once chosen for permanence revealed their fragility. Limestone weathered. Wood shifted. Fabrics thinned. To restore meant to replace, and replacement meant interpretation. Craftspeople studied photographs, letters, inventories, attempting to reverse engineer intention. But intention itself was unstable. Vanderbilt had revised constantly. The house had never existed in a single, fixed state. Which version, then, was being saved? Some rooms were returned to their earliest documented appearance, others to their most recognizable. Where was selectively erased? Evidence of adaptation, later furnishings, altered uses, was often removed to clarify narrative. What visitors encountered was not the house as it had lived, but the house as it could be explained. This clarity came at a cost. Restoration smoothed contradiction. It emphasized harmony where there had once been tension. The house grew quieter in a new way, not the silence of isolation, but the silence of resolution. Ambiguity, once embedded in the structure, was gradually reduced. Yet beneath this surface coherence, decay persisted. Mechanical systems aged faster than stone. Conservation needs multiplied. Climate change introduced new stresses, humidity, storms, unpredictability. The estate's scale magnified every challenge. There was no final restoration, only postponement. Survival remained provisional. Public admiration, however, deepened. Biltmore became a benchmark of preservation done right, of heritage responsibly managed. Its success validated a model in which private legacy could be sustained through public participation. The house appeared whole, confident, resolved. But resolution is rarely the same as truth. What restoration could not recover was the original uncertainty, the sense that this place had once been a gamble. That its existence had balanced precariously between assertion and absurdity. That it had nearly failed, quietly, not through catastrophe but through arithmetic. Those tensions now lived only in absence. In the sealed rooms. In the corridors no longer part of the tour. In the knowledge that the estate's continued life depended not on belief, but on relevance. Restoration preserved form, but it could not restore purpose. The reason Biltmore had been built, to anchor a life, to simulate permanence, had already dissolved. What remained was maintenance masquerading as memory. And yet, even in this thinning, the house endured. Not triumphantly, but stubbornly. It accepted the compromises required to persist. It allowed itself to be reinterpreted, reframed, repurposed, so long as its walls remained standing. In the final chapter, we step back from stone and strategy to consider what lingers after ambition exhausts itself. Not what Biltmore proves, but what it leaves behind. What lingers at Biltmore is not power, but its afterimage. The house stands as it always has, massive, assured, seemingly indifferent to the passage of those who move through it. Yet the authority it once implied has thinned into atmosphere. What remains is a presence shaped less by command than by endurance, less by certainty than by accommodation. George Vanderbilt did not leave behind a dynasty in the traditional sense. His wealth outlived him, but his vision did not replicate itself. There was no long chain of heirs refining and reaffirming intent. Instead, there was a single, immense gesture, followed by adaptation, reduction, reinterpretation. The estate survived not because it fulfilled its original purpose, but because it learned to release it. In that release, something human becomes visible. Biltmore was built to solve a private problem: how to live inside overwhelming fortune without being consumed by it. The solution was architectural: stone, distance, scale. For a time, it worked. The house insulated its creator from urgency, from judgment, from the noise of the world. But insulation is not resolution. It delays reckoning, it does not erase it. When Vanderbilt died, the house revealed its truth. It was not an anchor. It was a weight. Those who inherited it did not expand his ambition. They contained it. They narrowed its scope, surrendered its borders, and redefined its meaning so it could persist. In doing so, they transformed a monument of assertion into an instrument of compromise. This transformation is often framed as redemption. The land given back. The forests preserved. The house opened rather than sealed. These gestures matter. They represent a moral recalibration, an effort to reconcile private excess with public good. But they do not reverse origin. They do not undo the asymmetries that made such an estate possible in the first place. What Biltmore offers, instead, is clarity. It shows how wealth, when accumulated faster than culture can absorb it, seeks refuge in imitation, borrowing the symbols of older systems to legitimize itself. It shows how permanence cannot be purchased outright, only performed, and how performance eventually demands audience. And it shows how survival often requires letting go of authority. Today, visitors walk halls once designed to enforce distance. They admire craftsmanship, pause before windows, listen to curated silence. Few consider the solitude that necessitated such scale, or the anxiety that demanded such control. Fewer still sense the fragility that followed, when the estate hovered on the edge of irrelevance, saved not by reverence but by reinvention. Biltmore endures because it learned to be useful. In that usefulness lies both its success and its emptiness. The house no longer asks to be believed in. It asks only to be maintained, interpreted, visited. Its grandeur remains, but its ambition has expired. And perhaps that is its final lesson. That power leaves traces long after it withdraws. That architecture remembers what people try to forget. That even the most imposing structures cannot escape the limits of the lives they were built to serve. When the last footsteps fade and the lights dim, Biltmore returns to what it has always been, a vast, carefully ordered silence, holding the outline of a man who tried to make wealth stand still, and discovered that even stone must eventually learn to yield.